Hello everybody. So today I'm going to attempt to remake a video that I made last week with my headset on, and there was just too much noise in the headset. I'm certain to overlook some of the things that I brought up in the previous video, and I'm going to pretend that instead of realizing, as I did in process last week, that the two topics that I had were too significant to introduce together, I'm going to pretend that I haven't discovered that yet. And so the two topics that I wanted to introduce and talk about were the intelligence that we have when we are infants, with which we acquire complex social and cultural capacities and linguistic and mathematic capacities. So there's an intelligence that's native to our infants that has the potential to acquire almost any kind of culture, almost any kind of language. And while it doesn't disappear necessarily, as we grow older and as we use it to acquire these things, we might think of it as submerging, so that it becomes relatively inaccessible to us. And that the originary array of intelligences with which we enter our human existence, those things are so astonishingly powerful that it's surprising that we acquire things with them that are far less powerful and that are capable of severing our contact with those originary intelligences whose capacities we experienced commonly as very small children. So that was one of the topics that I was going to speak about, and the other one is dreaming. And that's the one I'm actually going to talk about. But these two topics are related in my mind, deeply related. In a sense, we might imagine that the dreaming consciousness is a resurgence of aspects of the originary consciousness with which we acquired language and the human sociocultural frameworks that we, throughout our lives, attempt to embody and express, primarily because we are rewarded for doing so and we are punished if we do not. So, dreaming. When we are children, we engage in an activity called play. And play is a kind of active conscious dreaming, or at least a mixture of certain faculties associated with what I will refer to as our dreaming minds, and the faculties associated with our waking minds. And most of us think, well, that's not true. No one has any idea what most of us think. Most people is a construct in language that's actually largely meaningless, and relatively nonsensical, because you'd never be able to get most people in front of you to examine whatever qualities they might have or not have, whatever inclinations they might possess. But many people would dismiss play as an unimportant, relatively non-pragmatic, childish activity. However, I will argue that that activity is actually crucial aspect of the foundations of our intelligence. And part of what happens as we get older, as we mature, or at least this is the language we often use, is that those aspects become inhibited, they become submerged, they become subconscious, and rather than being expressed in our everyday activities, they are expressed when we sleep, in dreaming. Some of them, some of the faculties involved with play, find expression in dreaming. If we're relatively lucky. Now, dreaming is a really complex array, a spectrum of experience and activity, participation. And like many things, we have sort of a catch-all phrase or word, this word dreaming, with which we intend to suggest that all such phenomena are the same, or at least our common experience is to suppose thus. But just as the fact that all of us were born as humans does not mean anything like we will have the same experience as humans, the fact that all of us dream does not mean that our dreaming experience will all be the same. And in fact, the word dreaming, reasonably understood, refers to a broad spectrum of experience and activity that occurs in a variety of different states of consciousness, not merely sleep. Many of us have heard the word vision used in the sense of one having a vision. Yeah? And a vision, this word refers often to the waking experience of a profound dreamlike state. Speaking from experience, this is often highly charged with emotional or possibly spiritual feelings, significance, profound significance, prophetic, a sense of prophetic qualities. And many other sort of features of our interiority with which we are ordinarily unfamiliar. To have a vision is usually this language refers to an extremely uncommon, highly charged experience of non-ordinary consciousness while awake. However, it is also possible to have visions while dreaming. So, for example, I have had experiences where, while awake, in an unusual situation, I felt suddenly that it was no longer possible for me to remain conscious, moved toward my bed. The moment I touched my bed, the moment that I reclined upon my bed, I became involved in a very unusually charged kind of dreaming. And this dreaming communicated to me features of an upcoming experience, an experience I had not yet had with a visitor. And this happened on a number of occasions during an uncommon period in my life where I was relatively inclined toward having non-ordinary experiences of consciousness. But I had never had an experience like this before, and since I'd never had such an experience, it was very difficult for me to understand what a vision meant, although the literature and people's stories suggest relatively clearly what such experiences may be like. So, without birdwalking too far down that road, I will suggest that all of us are at least capable, under the right circumstances, of having visionary experience. And to return to the topic at hand, dreaming is unlike that. That's just machine noise. When I use the word dream or dreaming, it's important to understand that I'm referring to a broad spectrum of related, but often significantly differentiable experience. Certainly, most of us are familiar with what is meant when we say daydreaming. And often we're not really speaking of an experience that is a lot like a dream. We're speaking of an experience where sort of our imagination floats into a trance-like state and may present us with, various figures or images or imaginal storylines and so forth. But to start out, I'm going to talk about the dreaming that happens at night and some of its peculiar features. And as I've said a number of times already, there are many different kinds of dreams. I have not cataloged them all. And of course, in order to say that they're different, we need to be motivated to differentiate between them, right? We need to be wanting to say, this is one kind of an experience, this is another kind, this is another kind. And I think it's useful just to understand that there are many different kinds of dreams that people experience. I do not know all of them. I am familiar with some of them from my own experience, and also from research and talking with others and so on and so forth. So for an example, in my own experience, I've had relatively ordinary dreams, which are the more or less common experiences of the mind inventing a universe while I'm asleep, and then having some sort of adventure in that universe. And I've also had very uncommon dreaming experiences, often related to either hypnagogic or hypnopompic phenomenon, and more commonly the latter, hypnopompic. Now, hypnagogic is a word that refers to the transition from waking to sleeping, and hypnopompic refers to the transition from sleeping to waking. And during hypnagogic and hypnopompic experiences, we may be we may have an uncommon relationship, very uncommon, we may experience non-ordinary consciousness. Because in these two phases, ordinarily we are largely unconscious. We don't generally realize, for example, I am falling asleep. I am in the between of sleeping and waking, or I'm in the between of waking and sleeping. But in those phases, very unusual things happen. Some of them can be terrifying, some can be enlightening, some can leave us with fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness itself, about spirituality, whether we have a soul, what the nature of the soul's involvement in dreaming is. And these are questions that we have to answer. We have to chase and respond to these questions ourselves. It's unrealistic to depend upon others to answer them, for they are questions that at least are moderately unique to each of us, the same way that our own interiority, our own minds are unique to us. So I think it's very important that though we can pose ideas about dreaming and consciousness and minds and so on and so forth, it's dangerous to explicitly state precisely what they are, what these things are, what they're about, what they're doing. There's a insect phenomenon here that's very intriguing to me, but I'm going to pass it by for the moment so that I can continue with you. So in my own experience, I've had what I'll call relatively ordinary dreams. I've had nightmares, and different kinds. In general, I find nightmares rather enjoyable if they're the scary kind. So that part of me awakens terrified, but another part of me is almost like laughing or thinks it's really funny and sees it as an adventure. So I'll sometimes wake up facing away from the room, having had a nightmare, and will find myself both completely frightened and not wanting to turn around because there could be something really terrifying in the other part of the room, and at the same time a sense of levity or hilarity or laughter. I will feel this, yeah? Now, I also have nightmares that are just bad, where I wake up feeling upset, or that I have suffered something really traumatic or relatively traumatic in the dreaming world. And I suspect that this is most of what people mean when they refer to nightmares. They're talking about an experience they definitely do not want to have. An experience that's emotionally painful, emotionally charged, frightening, or kind of disruptive and injurious emotionally, yeah? So there's a broad spectrum of kinds of nightmares, the same way there's a broad spectrum of kinds of dreams, and that nightmares are a subset of our dreaming experience. And I think we also have what I would call great dreams. And these are dreams that are so significant and unusual and often hyper-real that they may stay with us throughout. We may remember them throughout our entire lives, even if we don't ordinarily pay attention to our dreaming. And I've had a number of these, 12 to 15, perhaps more, perhaps some that are not remembered. But I have a record of the great dreams, both in text and in my mind, that I can kind of walk through. And these dreams may have some deep significance in relation to our lives and our life path, and particularly the life of our consciousness, right? Which, the life of the mind, the life path of our awareness, our peculiar interiority, our personal interiority, our psychological and psychic interiority, and its forms and transformations, and perhaps its paths, in its developmental paths. Yeah. So hopefully many of you may remember specific dreams as being fundamentally important and as standing out far above and beyond the ordinary dreaming, quote unquote, as if any dreaming were ordinary, that happens to us, hopefully very regularly. And we could at least include some of the unusual experiences that happen during uncommon states or uncommon activities, uncommon situations, such as things that could happen in meditation. I recall, for example, one time when I was meditating and I heard a peculiar conversation between two people that's seemingly far away in another place, in another room. The conversation had no useful content. It was as if I was sitting in on a lunchroom conversation in a business somewhere that I clearly wasn't. For at that time I was at a church actually with a group of people who were sitting zazen. And there are a vast array of experiences that can happen during meditation that have some relevance to the topic, but aren't precisely the same as dreams. then there are also experiences we can have during traumatic situations. For example, it's very common for people who've been in a car accident to describe something not unlike a dream. Time slows down. They have a profound experience of non-ordinary consciousness just prior to the event, often, though not all the time. And eventually the catastrophe occurs and usually seems unavoidable, even though it appears that time has slowed down. And I think this is really important, partly because the relationship between dreaming and time is entirely unclear. A dream may appear to occupy a vast temporal interval, and yet actually happen in a very brief or possibly even instantaneous moment. And so I think there's a relationship between this seeming the seeming downshift that happens during an accident in temporal pace and dreaming. I will speak a little later more about the relationship between dreaming and time. There are also, of course, situations in which we've been injured and we are having some kind of non-ordinary dreamlike or visionary experience. And also, it's very common for people who are severely ill to have unusual experiences of consciousness, awareness, dreaming, and so on, visionary states, etc. And I would suggest that some of those experiences are related to the capacity of dreaming to assist us in healing and transformation. In other words, that dreaming is perhaps fundamentally, but certainly in particular situations, very medicinal. So we have great dreams, we have visionary dreams, we have healing dreams, we have crisis dreams, we have nightmares. We have dreams in which something fundamental is communicated to us, and that we may emerge from a dream having learned something really profound. Dreams that involve examining text seem to be very peculiar and unique. Occasionally we can recover from a dream some text or some language. However, it seems that the relationship between dreaming and language is a very peculiar one. And although we believe that conversations have occurred, it's at least likely that something else was going on, right? In the same way that the analogy of light, which I'm going to call illumination, in a dream, is not actually light like the light around me, right? What we experience as language in a dream is similarly not exactly language. And so the dream comprises what I will call a paracosm, a seeming world whose features are familiar from our waking lives and yet at the same time unfamiliar and not the same, right? Light is not light, people are not people, animals are not animals, even though they qualify categorically according to the categories that we ordinarily have applied or would apply when awake. A paracosm is an imaginary universe with its own interior logics, categories, phenomenon, circumstances, guiding intelligences, senses, and so on. Surely if I am flying in a dream, it is not precisely the same thing as flying in the physical waking world. Similarly, if I am walking, it is not precisely the same thing. And one of my favorite questions about dreams, which really applies to almost any dream phenomenon, but I enjoy applying it in this specific spot, is what is the source of the analog of light in dreaming? What is it that produces the experience of illumination in dreaming? And I think this is a very important and fascinating question. It's not the kind of, it's the kind of question one wants to get married to, right? It's such a profound question that the goal isn't to answer it, which would of course dismiss it, but rather to keep relating with it more and more deeply over time and allow it to resonate and continue to reveal new features of its nature as we continue the quest. You know, the sort of, it's a question I've fallen in love with, right? And so it's the kind of thing I want to marry rather than just answer and get divorced from. And I think there are many important questions like this that relate to our human experience in our lives. And we're trained to entertain a question primarily in order to answer it. But that's really like getting a divorce, right? That's the end of the quest. And most of the good questions are so deep and so profound that an answer is a provisional step in a process of relating with such questions. And particularly where we're talking about something as staggeringly complex and beautiful and profound as dreaming, we want to be very, very, very careful about accepting relatively unsophisticated answers or explanations, right? Because in fact, to explain literally means to flatten, to make like a flat map of something. And when you flatten a dream, what you get is a plot, right? None of us actually, well, none of us is the wrong word, wrong phrase. It's incredibly difficult to remember a dream. So I think I'll branch to this aspect of the topic for a moment. But before I do, I'm just going to enumerate a few more unusual situations in dreaming. For me, one of the unusual kinds of dreams is a dream that takes place in the same room I am dreaming. This often suggests that I'm about to have an unusual experience, or that I am in the between of sleeping and waking on the hypnopompic side, and unusual phenomenon in consciousness may emerge. So I think that's another interesting feature of dreaming, is that occasionally we will dream in the place where we're actually asleep, or so it will seem to us. We will dream in the room we are sleeping. And this often, for me anyway, turns into some kind of non-ordinary experience. And I'll discuss some of those experiences a little bit later. The questions. The questions. I think we should be cautious about believing the waking mind's derivation of a dream. If someone asks us to tell them what we dreamt, generally what will be produced is not a dream. So when we're asked to remember a dream or to describe a dream, what we generally produce is a plot. We will say this happened, then that happened, then this happened. It's not actually clear from careful relation with my own dreams that there's a linear sequence of events in actual dreaming experience. The linear sequence may well be something imposed upon the unique form of memory that dreaming brings to life, the unique aspects and faculties of memory that occur in dreaming. I think that linearity and the idea that we've had an actual conversation in language are two things that the waking mind produces post hoc, after the experience. So ordinarily, if someone asks us, to tell them our dream, what we will produce is an explanation, a flattening, and that flattening will generally be in the form of a plot. This happened, then that happened, then this happened, so on and so forth. I felt these things, I saw these people, this situation occurred, and then I awoke. I doubt it. I have good reason to believe that the nature of dreaming is very different from the nature of a linear plot, a linear narrative, which is the imprimatur of the waking mind, not the dreaming mind. And I also suspect that for us to be able to honestly communicate a dream, we would have to begin dreaming again. We would have to have the dream again. Because in dreaming, the environments and players and circumstances and situations all possess non-ordinary domains of identity and meaning that in our ordinary waking consciousness are relatively impossible for us to have, with a few exceptions. One of them being visionary experience. Another one being, and I want to caution people about this because I think it's very dangerous to make certain kinds of comparisons here, but another experience we can have where things have non-ordinary connotations and dimensions of identity, where identity acquires a much less flattened array of features that are experienceable and meaningful to us. It can be under the influence of certain drugs, particularly perhaps psychedelic drugs. But I am very hesitant to suggest that we should use psychedelic drugs to seek these states. I think it's very important for us to acquire experience with what we would refer to as our unintoxicated waking minds that have capacities that actually far exceed those offered by psychedelic drugs. And I would like for us to have those experiences without the necessity of using an intoxicant. And I think that when we use an intoxicant, it introduces features that we might really be better off without. Now, this is just a personal perspective. Other people will argue, and I certainly I'm not trying to tell other people what to think or believe. I'm trying to say something like, I would like my child to have an actual adventure rather than being introduced to adventure by something like video games. And I have the same concern about intoxicants. I want us to have the adventures that our minds and our awareness and our consciousness are capable of natively, because if we are first exposed to intoxicants, we may then become confused. We may think, intoxicants are the doorway to these kinds of experiences, which they are not. They're certainly not the doorway. Even if they may sometimes be a doorway, they cannot be the doorway. And additionally, the experiences available through the use of most intoxicants and psychedelics seem to me at once both extremely intense, which can be dangerous, and there are other dangers involved, as well as somehow often, maybe not in all cases, but often untrustworthy. There's an aspect of them that I am suspicious of. And this was true even from the first experiences of my own with psychedelics in the 1970s when I was a teenager. I recall some of my first experiences and their profound intensity and the amazingly otherworldly qualities of consciousness. But I also felt like something's missing here. There's a promise implicit in this experience that isn't being fulfilled. And what would it be like to have that promise fulfilled, right, in my actual waking experience? I didn't realize at the time that one day I would discover what that was like. And it was far more astonishing than anything I could ever imagine, and made the experiences that I had with psychedelics seem very trivial indeed in comparison. So I want us to have profound dreaming and visionary experience, and until we are able to have this with our more or less ordinary mind and body, I'm very personally opposed to the introduction of intoxicants into the playing field. That's a story for another day, but I wanted to put that on the table. To return to the previous topic, what happens when we try to explain a dream? We get what I would think of as the fossilized remains of dreaming. We get a plot. And if we could actually tell a dream, I believe that both people involved, the one telling it and the recipient or the listener, would have to begin dreaming. And even if they did this, which isn't entirely impossible, very unlikely, it still wouldn't be the same dream that the dreamer was expressing. So I don't think it's incredibly difficult to communicate anything authentic about dreaming, primarily because the mind that uses language and explanations and has models and so on and so forth is not the mind of dreaming. And the mind of dreaming doesn't care about those things very much. They are, in fact, if you begin to wonder, for example, in a dream, well, this person who is my sister appears to me today to be a man. Why is that? That's the kind of wondering that can actually lead to a variety of phenomenon. So when we have questions about things like, how did I get here? Why is it daytime but there's no sun? Because often I don't recall any experience of ever seeing the sun in a dream. I've once seen stars, at least once, and that was a very peculiar and non-ordinary dreaming experience. And this goes back to like, what is the source of the analog of light that is illumination in dreaming? We could state the question more simply, what is the source of light in dreaming? But it's clear that whatever the illumination in dreaming isn't exactly light, right? And there's lots of interesting features of this question that I'll come back to in a moment. So the attempt to tell a dream, or even to record a dream, usually will mean to record a plot, right? And a plot is not a dream. A plot is an explanation, right? A flattening into linear events of certain aspects of a dream that we are capable of preserving across the bridge between dreaming consciousness and waking consciousness. And that is a very strange bridge. And I think it's very important to become intimate with this transformation, this between place, the one that happens as we are falling asleep. There is a transformation. Actually, there's an array of transformations that occur that we can distinguish between different phases. And similarly, from sleeping to waking, there's an array of transformations that occur. And I think it's profoundly intriguing and highly charged to become aware, to maintain consciousness somehow while these transitions are going on, or to be accidentally exposed to the transformations because we are not, as we would ordinarily be, we're not merely unconscious, which is what happens apparently most of the time for many people. We're just not aware of the astonishing things that occur between being awake and being authentically asleep, and between being asleep and becoming authentically awake. And those are some astonishing transformations, trust me. Some of them are quite terrifying. Some of them would intrigue us to such a degree that we would be hard-pressed not to see them as spiritually significant, or as implying a spiritual backdrop to all these phenomenon. So our records of dreaming are not very good. Yeah? They are crude. They are the waking mind's explanation or flattening into a linear narrative. And my actual experience of dreaming is that the nature of linearity in dreaming is suspect. It's not clear at all. I mean, one might ask, well, if we have the experience of things happening in a dream, and they're not linear, it doesn't go from this to that, to that, to that, to that, to that, what is happening? And two of the interesting models that we can use are spirals and concentric circles. And both of these forms are much more like the spirit of dreaming than the linear plot model is. Nonetheless, it's relatively natural for us to produce a linear plot from a dream. Most of us who have attempted to record dreams or keep a dream diary, which, by the way, affects and deeply influences the dreaming mind, and it's something that I suggest strongly for anyone who's interested in learning more about dreaming, and I hope you all are, because it's one of the most mysterious and fascinating aspects of our human experience. Every night, our consciousness produces these sometimes wildly beautiful or terrifying paracosms, and we inhabit them. And these activities are fundamental to the nature and health of our conscious awareness, our minds, our waking minds, our intelligence, our memory, and so on. So I encourage you to explore and have the great adventure of your human, existence that dreaming is the doorway to, is a profound doorway to. Now, one might imagine that it's very difficult to produce a spiraline story, and yet I think it's no problem at all for the dream, or a story of concentric circles like those seen in a pond where one drops a stone into a pond. And yet again, the dreaming mind is so different from waking consciousness, and in a way, in comparison, so magical, that in that state of awareness, those forms are natural to it. And the reason that I've been able to discover this is that I've had really unusual experiences with dreaming. One of the most unusual was, by the way, many of those experiences happen in the in-between phase, in the from waking to sleeping, the hypnagogic phase, or the from sleeping to waking, the hypnopompic phase. Whenever we're able to have some kind of awareness of these transformations, it's extremely common to have wildly unexpected and unusual experiences. In fact, I would argue that they are unexpectable because they're so unlike our ordinary experiences of waking and consciousness, and even of dreaming, that they can be really shocking. They can be highly motivating. They can be terrifying. They can be destabilizing. They can even be sort of parapsychotic, because they're, in many cases, they are incoherent. They're not fundamentally coherent states of consciousness. Sometimes I have imagined that on the way to sleep, I travel through a tunnel of something like concentric circles. And this tunnel is conical, And as I travel through this tunnel, various kinds of phenomenal experience can occur. Various kinds of sounds or sensations, rumbling, crackling, screaming, electrical feelings, tones, weird music, non-otherworldly music, all kinds of things, as if my consciousness is transforming in phases over time. Yeah. And there's something similar that happens from sleeping to waking, but its character is different. So in my experience, the hypnagogic transformations can produce a variety of very unusual sensory and sensational phenomenon. Whereas the hypnopompic phenomenon experiencing that transition tend to produce things that are wildly experiences such as, for example, sleep paralysis, or some other common experiences of the hypnopompic aspect are the man at the end of the bed, or at the doorway, or at the window, the sort of bad dark man phenomenon. Often this man is just seen as a shadowy figure who is felt as being malevolent or dangerous, threatening. Sometimes this man has a hat. Very uncommonly, people can see the man's face. And this experience seems to be relatively more common among females than males. And then there's another relatively common experience, which has been remarked upon throughout history, of the felt sense of something sitting on one's chest, like maybe a little monster or a goblin or something like this, right? A pressure, something on the chest, yeah? And I think this has to do with the fact that it's not just our brain that is dreaming. When I was very young, I've been fascinated with dreaming since I was a child, and I never really believed the relatively dismissive explanations of adults. I learned to distrust adult dismissive explanations when I was very small, particularly about dreaming, because they would mostly just dismiss it. They would just say, like, well, that's just some nonsense that happens to you while you're asleep. Clearly, that's not what's going on. In fact, it turns out that if you can't, from what we understand from some research, and it's still early days, if an animal is prohibited from dreaming, it will soon perish. It will lose the capacity to maintain homeostasis, meaning to maintain its body temperature, in pretty short order, about a week. And at least for the animals they killed this way. Also, dreaming is very clearly associated with the regeneration of certain aspects of the physical body, certain organs, physical metabolism, cell cleansing, things like this. This is my own perspective. I'm not sure there's a lot of research that supports this yet. But even as a child, I could feel that when I was dreaming, something was happening in my belly, right? And I think our guts are much more involved in dreaming than we imagine. Dreaming is not a thing that just happens in the brain. Even though we are inclined to think that the brain is the locus of consciousness, it's very clear to me from much of my experience that that's not the only thing going on, and that to the degree that's true, it's true of certain aspects of consciousness. So if we are, we may not remember our dreams every night. We may never remember dreams. Sometimes we awaken feeling that we've dreamt, but having no memory of the actual content. Yet, I suspect most of us dream when we are sleeping. Some dreaming is going on, yeah? And if we don't dream, something catastrophic begins to happen. Our health suffers, memory suffers. Research has shown that dreams and dreaming are crucial to structuring short-term and probably long-term memory, so that there's a profound link between dreaming and memory. No dreaming, less ability to structure memory. No dreaming, memory may begin to break down. And in fact, we may someday discover a link between certain kinds of problems with dreaming and certain kinds of cognitive damage, such as dementia and Alzheimer's and so on. Mnemosyne was the mother of the muses to the Greeks. That's, I think, Mnemosyne, Mnemosyne. She was the mother of the muses, and these are the arts that memory depends upon. That depend upon memory. And in case it's not clear, pretty much everything we do with our minds is fundamentally dependent on memory. So if dreaming is the origin experience that structures and refreshes and generates the capacities of memory, it's much more fundamental to the nature of being human and to our awareness than anyone has guessed yet, or than at least than it is common for people to suppose, right? And I think this is true. I think dreaming is absolutely fundamental to the experience of consciousness. And it is refreshing and regenerative and nourishing and supportive of all kinds of different aspects of our waking mind ability that we depend on to navigate in the world and to understand our own experience, and particularly to derive meaning from anything. Because the derivation of meaning is almost an act of dreaming while awake. Another thing that is relatively uncommonly remarked upon is that it seems to me there are at least two different phases of dreaming, and they correlate with the hypnagogic transformation and the hypnopompic transformation. So that we have particular kinds of dreaming experiences or dreaming experience on the way to sleep. And some of that experience is quite bizarre and would actually be impossible to pose as a narrative. And I've had many experiences of this hypnagogic transformation of consciousness, and it can be really bizarre and plotless. Often it's just an experience of some very unusual situation or circumstance that may involve nonsensical constructs and forms and environments and transformations. For example, just to give you some example, right? My viewpoint could be traveling along the ground next to the earth with no body and seeing strange transformations of the environment. So like a disembodied viewpoint. That's just one example. I could give hundreds if I wanted to take the time. But I've found that the hypnagogic transformations of consciousness are very unusual and unexpected, often bizarre, on the way to dreaming. And this would happen after, by the way, the fundamental transformation from waking to sleeping, that if we have experience of it, may produce very unusual phenomenon such as I described earlier with tones or the felt sense of rumbling or crackling sounds or things that sound like people screaming, things that sound like bizarre kinds of choirs. I think the the imaginal experience comes after the sort of tunnel of transformations, as I imagine it, that lead from waking consciousness into the paradreaming that happens when we first begin to fall asleep, or at least often happens then. And I suspect that those experiences of phenomenon are experiences of consciousness transforming, of the sort of changing of the guard, of the waking mind's relatively severe grip on consciousness being released in phases, right? Click, 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 click. And finally, when it's fully released, then we emerge into this imaginal, experience that's relatively familiar. Even if at the hypnagogic side it can be very bizarre and non-plot, like unplottable, right? If someone asked us to explain that experience, we wouldn't even be able to form a linear explanation, really. We might just say something like I said, right? My perspective was moving through a variety of environments that changed in very strange or unexpected ways. Whereas again, the experience of hypnopompic transformation often involves some kind of crisis, yeah? At least for me. I'd love to hear, I'm fascinated by other people's stories about their experiences of these transformations. And it's interesting, we can think either of like, a bell that goes down and comes up, right, when we're sleeping, something like this, or we can think of a bell that goes up and down, right? So that this is hypnagogia, this is deep sleep, this is hypnopompia, or the other way, right? This is hypnagogia, this is deep sleep, this is hypnopompia.
Sorry.
It's okay. Today in the garden, it's very, very busy because it's the weekend. So one of the things that has happened, one of the reasons that I'm interested in what is the source of light in dreaming, this question, is that I've had experiences in dreaming where, for example, either there is no light and I'm trying to like say turn on a light or something, or I'm in relative darkness and I'm trying to turn on a light. I've also had experiences where the light is just absent. There's no light in the dream. And those experiences for me were very troubling. But often if I'm dreaming if I'm having a dream that's taking place in the same room where I'm actually asleep, there can be very unusual hypnopompic phenomenon associated with that experience. And for me, these have taken two primary forms. The first is the attempt to turn on a light. So I'll go to my light switch, I'll try to turn the light on, nothing happens. This led to a secondary phenomenon where I would go get my flashlight. I would just think, oh, the power's out, and But what is power? What is the power in the dream? What would actually cause the light to go on? So I'll get my flashlight and try to turn that on, and that won't go on, and then I'll become really confused, and I'll be like, I'll have this kind of question, right? And this is the kind of question that I was talking about earlier. Let's say I'm in a dream. Okay. So there's a branch point that can occur in a dream where we begin to ask a certain kind of question. For example, why am I in an ancient castle with a tiny pink Tyrannosaurus chasing me? This doesn't make any sense. And that question tends to have three possible resolutions. The first is the dream backfills. It presents you with a kind of imaginary history that, for whatever reason, is sufficient to calm the concern that has arisen as a question, and the dream just continues on largely as it was before. Another possible outcome is that the question becomes formal the state checking aspect of consciousness gets involved, and this produces an irresolvable conflict, and that leads to us waking up, right? And I have a neologism for this. I call this three-branch thing a branch, partly because it's a branch. So the first is that the dream sort of backfills a history that satisfies the question, and you go on dreaming. The second, well, they don't have any specific order, but as I'm enumerating them, the second is the question becomes formalized, state checking becomes involved, that leads to you realize like, oh, I'm dreaming, and you wake up. And the third is the relatively gentle intrusion, so that the dream doesn't just collapse like a bubble. The relatively gentle intrusion of an aspect of waking consciousness, and this leads to lucidity, the awareness that one is dreaming, and the wide range of phenomenon that are possible under that aegis, right, in that circumstance. And a lot of people who are interested in dreaming are really interested in lucid dreaming, and I consider lucid dreaming to be a unique subset of the possibilities of dreaming experience, and a fascinating one, and one that can certainly be exciting and astonishing and educational. But I think of it as the gentle intrusion into the paracosmal storm that is a dream of waking consciousness. And the reason I say gentle is that if the waking consciousness intrudes too forcefully, the manifold, the bubble made of bubbles of dreaming, tends to collapse and we awaken, right? So I think of lucidity as the relatively gentle, tangential intrusion of certain aspects of waking consciousness that then are allowed to play within the dreamscape, within the paracosm, as faculties. And this is certainly astonishing and something worthy of exploration. However, at the same time, it's not the same as an ordinary dream, and there may be features of ordinary dreaming that are very important to preserve that can be lost if we're consistently having lucid dreaming. Again, I say maybe. I just have a modest concern about that. I'm not making any kind of absolute assertion. I'm just saying the dreaming mind's unique anatomy and activity may be important to leave undisturbed by the waking mind's agendas and faculties and impositions, so that it may be important that we have, that even if we're capable of lucid dreaming, that we also have non-lucid dreaming. And it may also be important that, and this is something that would rarely occur to people, it may be important that we have dreams that we don't remember, right? That we don't transfer the plot of into waking consciousness, because these are two different kinds of things. A dream that is entirely unremembered by waking consciousness is a different experience from one that can be remembered, plotted, described, recorded, and so on. So I think that there are many aspects of our dreaming experience that are important to consider with great care, and to be aware, to have awareness that these aspects may be very delicate in some ways, and may need to be protected from the relatively penetrative and intrusive aspects of our waking thought, ideation, knowledge-seeking, conceptual minds, linguistic intelligence, and so on, cultural intelligences, and so on. Dreaming is... It can be useful to think of dreaming as a universe unto itself, but one that the faculties we depend on in our waking consciousness are reliant on. In other words, the dreaming we do creates a supportive understructure for our waking consciousness. I'm going to circle back now to dreams that happen in the same room I'm in, attempts to turn on the lights, and so on and so forth. Often in these hypnopompic experiences, again, I'll try to turn a light on, that won't work. I'll go for my flashlight, that won't work. Now I'm at a grange, right? Now I'm at a place where I'm going to ask, hey, what's going on here? Why? What could possibly cause both my light and my flashlight to not work? Yeah. And that represents the introduction of state checking and so on and so forth. What often happens here is I will now encounter some unusual physical phenomenon. In one case, there were some stones hanging on fishing line from the ceiling, and they were moving about in a kind of jerky, sort of magnetic way. And I grabbed them, and it was a terrifying feeling of this profound force, this sort of metaphysical or electrical force. And another time, I had the same kind of experience where I grabbed a door handle, and something was yanking it back and forth, really jerkily, yeah, with profound power. And I think these are hypnopompic experiences of something related to the nature of dreaming and the nature of the transformations of consciousness that are happening, particularly when we're in the between phase, right? So I've had a variety. I've also experienced on the hypnopompic side sleep paralysis, which is a truly frightening thing. Generally, it feels like one's about to die, can't move, can't breathe, often can't see. Maybe you feel that you've opened your eyes and you still can't see. A couple of those experiences, eventually I decided to go with sleep paralysis because I was really curious about what would happen. Even though it seemed like it would be lethal, it wasn't. The one time I was able to do that, what happened was, well, this is my, waking world description anyway. I had decided that the next time I experienced this, I was going to let go. And it didn't take very long for that to happen. And it was, actually, it happened right after one of those experiences of grabbing onto something that was jerking around in a very frightening way. And then I awoke, and then I was paralyzed and blind and seemed that I couldn't breathe. And I just decided I'm letting go. And in that moment, it seemed that my consciousness rose up from my torso, came out through the top of my head, and emerged into a completely inexplicable state. There was no memory of myself, of Darren. There was no memory of my humanity or any of the things associated with it at all. There was no memory of the world or objects or colors or light or sound or any of the sensory phenomenon that we're, familiar with. And although I don't actually understand what happened, one way I might describe it was that I was what seemed to be an enormous serpentine movement. I was like a gigantic black snake in blackness. There was nothing to see. There was nothing to do but to move in this sinuous fashion. And that movement was ecstatic. Every time I made this movement, it was more ecstatic than the last time. And it seemed somehow, at least upon awakening, I thought of it this way, that movement was the cause of all movement, that I was omnipotently the prime mover. I was that thing whose movement caused all other movement. And it was absolutely ecstatic, but there was no sense of identity or self or other or even of activity. There was no distinguishing sense. There was just the felt sense of the ecstasy of making this kind of serpentine movement in a field of nothing. And that went on for some time. And then there was this sort of very sudden transformation of consciousness where I came back into my human body and identity and thought, and some little voice inside me, the voice of a child perhaps, said with great excitement something like, "You were a monster." And I was fascinated by this experience because it was unlike anything, it was unlike any other experience I've ever had. And it was certainly an experience of like non-human. It was a non-human experience. There was nothing human about it. I have no way to describe it. I don't know how to classify it. I don't need to know. I just understand that the one time I let go into sleep paralysis, this very astonishing phenomenon occurred. And I think this is the kind of, I mean, by the way, that's the kind of thing that might be meant when we refer to visionary experience. This was a kind of visionary experience that resulted from me releasing during a hypnopompic experience of sleep paralysis. Okay, that's a lot of sneezes. There's so many things to discuss. So yeah, one of the things that I've only recently come to understand is that I'm dreaming when I'm falling asleep, and I'm dreaming between sleeping and awakening. I don't know what happens in the deep middle of those two states. It's possible that there's dreaming going on there, but I may or may not remember it. And sometimes, the ability to remember dreams can change radically in different phases of our lives. I've had situations where, for example, I was capable of remembering 7 or 8 dreams in great detail. I've had other situations where I can only really remember the dreams that take place just before I've awakened, and there's varying degrees of detail. The use of various kinds of drugs changes dreaming experience. Alcohol changes dreaming experience radically. The use of marijuana appears to largely transform, partly obliterate dreaming experience, though each, your mileage may vary. Each person is unique and will respond at least somewhat uniquely to the ongoing introduction of intoxicants. But alcohol and marijuana both seem to have very deleterious effects on our dreaming experience in general. And in my own experience, the cessation of use of either of those drugs after having used them for some time is likely to produce very profuse and sometimes, chaotic experiences of dreaming as our dreaming mind sort of comes back online, so to speak. Again, everyone's experience is going to be a little different. Psychedelics probably also have effects on dreaming. And one thing that I really want to highlight is something that many of us have never experienced, unfortunately, which is pretty much everything we do. Like our daily lives affect our dreaming. Our work affects our dreaming. Our relationships affect our dreaming. Random encounters and situations we have in life affect our dreaming. I know from my own experience that I will have dreams of historical circumstances. Previous places I've worked are very common. Occasionally, previous lovers or friends or relationships will appear. So in a sense, the dreaming mind can act a bit as a lifetime library, and it can pull from various epochs of our lives and even mix them together. But what I'm wanting to highlight here is that many of us have some kind of religious or ceremonial experience. And authentic ceremonial experience can produce actually what I would consider to be a unique kind of dreaming. A kind of dreaming that is accessible through no other transport. And I have recently had some ceremonial experience, thankfully, that definitely produced echoes of very profound, deep, rich dreams that were clearly the result of that ceremonial experience. Now, that's such a broad catch-all term. What do I mean by ceremony? And I don't have the time to explain it, but when we engage in ceremonial activity, particularly in ceremonial activity that is ancient, that has ancient traditions associated with it, particularly with peoples who have been associated with this ceremonial activity for thousands or tens of thousands of years. It's interesting. There's an owl pellet here. Those experiences can have profound effects on our dreaming and can actually produce kinds of dreams that are entirely unlike what would happen in our dreaming world otherwise. There are forms of travel that can happen in dreaming. There are forms of participation in contexts that are unfamiliar to us, that have never been encountered before in our actual lives. There are a wide array of phenomenon that can occur in dreaming when we're exposed to ceremonial and participate in ceremonial activity while we are awake. The terrain is so mysterious and astonishing. And I suppose, to circle back to where I began, before we had complex minds that were fully enculturated and enlanguaged, we played. We had play. And we had imagination. And imagination and play are experiences that depend on the capacity to introduce, to have what we might refer to as it's not exactly lucid waking, but it's the obverse of lucid dreaming, right? It's where aspects of the dreaming consciousness are gently introduced into the waking consciousness so as to not entirely collapse waking consciousness into dreaming, and yet to adventure, to adventure in waking consciousness with aspects of our dreaming mind guiding and present in that experience. And this is one of the ways that I think of the play of children and particularly the imaginal play of children. I think of this as, they say we grew out of it. I don't believe that. I think what happened is, instead, more likely anyway, what happened is that a process somewhat like the analogy I'm about to make. Imagine the consciousness is in the beginning pure flow, right? It has no structure. It just flows. And the flows may form liquid structures like turbulence and things like this, but they don't form solid structure. So consciousness is in the beginning a lot like water. And what happens is, at night when we dream, we begin to establish structured memory. And at first there's like a tiny little island in the middle of the dreaming ocean. And then each time we fall asleep and dream, and our memories become more structured, there's a little more of the island. And the island disappears at night, right? The oceans rise up and we just dream wildly. And then by day, we're having more or less structured experience. And every night, there's a little more structure in the island. The dreaming waters roll over it at night. When they recede, there's more structure. And this is really just the instructuring of memory and of what I'll refer to as representational memory and representational cognition. Ideas, models, names, language, cultural norms, cultural expectations, so on and so forth. So over time, the island of structured consciousness is growing. And in the beginning, it's not significant enough to inhibit our dreaming consciousness while we're awake, but over time it becomes significant enough that eventually it more and more inhibits that consciousness, it more and more inhibits our imagination. And so it's not that we grow out of play or the kind of imagination that can turn a stick into a ship and a little bit of water into an ocean and so on and so forth. What happens instead is that the structured aspects of consciousness submerge the dreaming mind, upon which the experiences of insight, creativity, imagination, and meaning depend. Here is another owl pellet, an old one, an old owl pellet. I find these very interesting, and I sometimes seek them because, is there another one? Nope. Because there are specific trees that are preferred by the raptors to perform their digestive activities in. And particularly this specific activity, the regurgitation of undigested prey material. And there's something relevant there there's something relevant in the regurgitation of this undigested material. There's something mysteriously relevant to the topic at hand. So I think our ancestors, our distant ancestors and Aboriginal peoples and Indigenous peoples have a very different experience of their relationship with representational cognition than we moderns do. And I believe that ceremonies are in part the active elicitation of the dreaming consciousness while we are awake and together, so that we begin to dream as a community together while awake. And there are thousands of different kinds of examples of this, but I'm afraid us moderns have replaced this with things like TV shows and movies and YouTube videos and things on screens. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that our exposure to these things has transformed our dreaming dramatically, and in fact may inhibit and damage some of the faculties with which we dream by replacing them with external representations. And in case it isn't obvious, this is a long-standing habit that has driven and advanced what we refer to as our modernity, which in many cases really comprises a series of amputations. A series of catastrophic losses of faculties, abilities, and relationships that were fundamentally intrinsic to our humanity before they were replaced by conveniences, machines, technologies, various kinds of slavery, being trapped in boxes, with windows in them, inside which nothing moves except that thing on a screen, right? The only thing that moves inside those boxes are machines, things on screens, or if we're lucky, pets. And maybe we have a few houseplants and a breeze comes through the house and we see that living movement of the houseplants that is magical and I think productive, right? Can induce trance in us. By the way, here is another. This is the owl pellet that I first saw. And this is a relatively recently exuded pellet that's been stepped on a few times. So I'm very concerned about returning to us, to our common experience, the faculties and abilities that come with dreaming. I think that before we had radio, we certainly had telepathy. Before we had televisions, we used to dream together. And I've had experiences of dreaming together with other people that are astonishing and validatable. There are a vast array of aspects of our interiority and our humanity, our intelligence, our dreaming consciousness that moderns have no experience of. So I suppose that I'm encouraging and want to see a renaissance where we recover these things together through questing and curiosity and experiment, through fascination, mutual encouragement, celebration, through ceremony, that we learn to recover the incredible array of possibilities and faculties that are native to the world of our dreaming minds, a world from which I believe our waking minds are born, a world which I believe our waking minds eventually overwhelm and dominate. And I think this is unhealthy, and we need to be capable of producing a kind of medicine for our modern awareness, our modern consciousness, that returns to us many of the faculties and opportunities that have been lost, transformed, represented, and sold back to us in useless counterfeits or in toxic counterfeits. And this is one of the common ongoing agendas of that very oxymoronic thing we call progress. For me, progress would be an ever deepening understanding of and access to the fundamental nature of our consciousness, our humanity, our interiority, our dreaming faculties. And I would call what we're doing instead either disease or digress at best, right? So there are so many questions here that I haven't yet been able to address or approach. But hopefully I've at least catalyzed your curiosity, your imagination, your wonder, the sense of awe that I myself have at just the astonishing beauty and sophistication and mystery of our interiority, yeah, of those faculties from which our minds are born, and unfortunately, which waking consciousness too often dominates and submerges. The questions are wide open. Nobody knows the answers to these things, and I wouldn't trust anyone's answers. These are quests we must embark upon together, with and for each other. We must embark upon personally, with great fervency and reverence and wonder and awe and curiosity, imagination, creativity. And I'm looking forward to what we can accomplish together, and to the future, and to the places these questions can lead us, to the experiences they can lead us into. I trust them. I trust the dreaming mind. I trust the origins of our complex consciousness. And I trust that within them we will rediscover relationships that have long been lost, and without which our humanity is somehow made more shallow. So for today, thank you for joining me. I am here in the living world, which I think is always dreaming, we are here together, and there are opportunities before us more astonishing than any stories we've ever been told by science or religion or anything. And I hope that together we can pursue those opportunities, rediscover them, embody them, share them, and return them to the children of our people and to the living world from which they emerge as a natural and beautiful expression. Thank you so much for joining me.